Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, Mr. John Hayes.
Thank you very much. All right, what's wrong with this picture up here that's on the introductory slide? Can anybody tell me? What's wrong? Well, and there's only one person raising their hand. There's only one person engaged. If you do that to me today, I'm going to be extremely disappointed. Deal? Fair enough? Okay, I'm here to talk about innovation and what I have come over the years to define as the 7 keys of innovation. And as you see at the footnote at the bottom, this is a view from the trenches with a little bit of input from academia, meaning that these are kind of the things that I've observed over the past few years. Thank you for reminding me that it's been 41 years. Many days it feels like 80, but most of the time it feels like 5, as my good friend Bill Todd will tell you. But in talking about the keys to innovation, we need to start and ask the initial question, why? I mean, what's important about innovation? Well, first of all, as everybody knows, I think, innovation drives the economy. It's what creates jobs. It's what makes the U.S. competitive in the world. It's incredibly important. It can also create great personal wealth. Many of the real fortunes in this country have come from people that are innovators and have created entire industries. The other great fortunes in the country come from people who manage that money that those folks are creating. The other side of that, though, is it may not create great personal wealth. In fact, it can create exactly the opposite. And that's the risk that any entrepreneur, any innovator takes. It also puts to work things that we learned at Tech. And I look back on my education at Tech as being extremely important, including the fact that as an industrial and systems engineer, we learned to analyze, design, and build. Unfortunately, I didn't quite understand you're supposed to start with the analysis first before you build. But gradually over time, that kind of made sense, and we started working at it. And then finally, innovating and doing these kind of companies is a whole lot more fun than having a real job. And I highly recommend it if you want to get up in the morning and look forward to going to work, and you want to feel excited when you come home in the evening, most days. So what are the 7 keys? I'm going to tell you all 7 keys up front rather than revealing them as we go through the slides, because you can't really, when we look at the things that have occurred in the examples I'm going to show you, many of the keys kind of interplay. The first is the right idea. The second is the right product, which many people think is the idea, but as I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes, it's not. The product is very different and distinct from the idea. It comes from the idea, but it's really what makes the idea successful. The right people, absolutely paramount. You can't do this with the right people. A willingness to take risk, perseverance. As Winston Churchill said, never, never, never give up. And that's exactly what an innovator needs as his mantra or her mantra to be successful at this. And then, but at the same time, you've got to be willing to make changes. You've got to be willing to make course corrections. That doesn't mean not being diligent in pursuing what you're trying to do, but what it means is making adjustments as you get more and more information. Then finally, protect what you create. And that doesn't necessarily mean a patent, although it might, but it really means watching out for who's coming behind you. Let's go and talk about each one of these. When I talk about the right idea, I've got sort of an ideal in my mind of what the right idea is. First of all, I think it's got to be a big market. There's no point in doing this if it's a tiny, tiny market and it's not going to create a lot of revenue. Second, it needs to have high margins for a couple of reasons. Number one, profits give you an opportunity of covering up a lot of mistakes. If you're in a low margin business and you make mistakes, you're probably going to be out of business. The other thing that high margins do is create great exit valuations, whether it's a public offering or whether it's selling it to a larger company at some point. The other thing is, and this is kind of controversial when I've talked to people about it, and that is it needs to have a low cost of entry, at least for you. It'd be great if it has a low cost of entry for you, but a high cost of entry for your competitors. But if it doesn't have a low cost of entry for you, then you're not going to end up owning very much of it at the end of the day. And last is, I think there's a huge amount of benefit if you can pick an innovation in a blue ocean. The book, how many have read the book Blue Ocean Strategy? You really should. It's fantastic. It came out in about 2007. And what they basically talk about is the advantage of being in a blue ocean free from competition compared to a market that is red from the blood of competition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through here. So continuing with this idea of finding the right idea is, how do you find it? And the answer is you don't. It finds you. Most of the right ideas that people come up with have come from friction. I was talking to an ME here before this session, and MEs know a lot about friction. That's what the whole department is about, right? Reducing friction. That's also what entrepreneurship and innovation is about, and that's reducing friction. Because you see something and you say, this doesn't work right. It's too expensive. There's too much labor. It's too hard to use. This is ugly. There's got to be a better way. And that driving force, there's got to be a better way, is what makes innovation. Now, I want to take you back to the year after I graduated from tech, 1972, and I want to kind of set the technology timeline for you. This is 25 years after the transistor was invented. And that's important for a lot of reasons. Does anybody here know who invented the transistor? Good. Well, no, he claims to have. He actually didn't. But who? What organization? Bell Labs. Okay, why did Bell Labs create the transistor? Why did Bell Labs create the transistor? Well, actually, they did. I mean, they worked for 20 years to create it. And what were they trying to replace? What was the transistor designed to do to replace? Vacuum tubes for what purpose? For amplification. They were trying to replace vacuum tubes for amplification, and they were trying to replace something else. Does anybody know? Relays for switching. The transistor is an amplifier and a switch. Why did Bell Labs care about amplification and switching? What were they trying to do? They were trying to automate dialing a long-distance call. In about 1915, they started installing relay panels in central offices in municipal areas, which could have basically about 10,000 phones per central office. And through the rotary phone, it would then switch and be able to transfer the call without an operator. By taking the operator out of the local call, they dramatically reduced the cost of making a local phone call. The problem is the rotary phones and the relays didn't work for long distance. It was too complicated. You couldn't get that many relays lined up right to complete a long distance call. So you may have seen this in movies where somebody says, I got a call across the country. They call an operator who then patches it together in patch panels and calls them back when the call is completed. So what Bell Labs knew is if they had automatic dialing on long distance calls, they could dramatically bring the cost of long distance down. And what happens when costs come down? Demand goes up. And that's exactly what happened. So they invented the transistor to solve the switching problem, replacing the relays, and the amplification problem, because in a long distance call, there's enough resistance in the lines that the signal drops, and you've got to constantly amplify it as it goes a long distance. And back then, a vacuum tube, how many of you have actually seen a vacuum tube? Has anybody here seen one? Okay. Not very many. A few old folks. The vacuum tube would last maybe 1,000 hours and then had to be replaced. So they were very expensive to maintain. And that's what Bell Labs was trying to do. But what it did is it opened up the building blocks for everything else, for computers in particular, and allowed people to go in and start building much, much less expensive computers that were faster, consumed less electricity. So in 1972, what we had, 25 years into the transistor, mainframes and mini computers were abundant. DEC was the preeminent mini computer manufacturer. No microcomputers on the market yet. Memory was not integrated circuits yet. It was core memory. COBOL, Fortran, and assembler were the languages. Punch cards were still in use. You'd take a box of punch cards over to the Rich Computing Center. They'd drop it in the Burroughs 5500 machine. You'd come back the next day to pick up your run. You'd scoot up one card, you fixed it, put it back in, came back the next day. Not very efficient compared to the way you program today. And finally, the 8-track cassette was giving, 8-track tape was giving way to the cassette. That was sort of the state of the technology. Does anybody know what this thing is on the top left here? What is that? Speak up. A typewriter. How many in the room have actually ever typed a document on a typewriter? Oh, wow, more than I thought. The machine, that's an IBM Selectric typewriter, first introduced in 1962, the paramount typing machine of the time. The machine underneath it is a Frieden robotyper, which basically runs off of a punch paper tape that you could program a letter into the tape, type the name and address, punch the button, it would run the tape and automatically type the letter. That was the state of the art when I went to work for Senator Talmadge right out of Tech. And I looked at that and I said, this is crazy. I mean, this is the way we're trying to respond. The senator had become chairman of the Agriculture Committee the year before. He then was named to the Watergate Committee. Mail volume went up from 100 letters a day to over 1,000. You couldn't respond to a letter that had more than one topic in it with the Frieden machine. I mean, if it was one topic, you could put it in a box, they could type that and send that out, but if it was multiple topics, you couldn't do it. But then the worst part is there was no way of indexing that. We made 2 carbon copies, honest to goodness, carbon copies. One got filed by date, the other one got filed by subject matter. So when the constituent wrote back in 3 weeks and said, Senator, you didn't answer my letter, you could go find the original letter and try to answer it. And so the solution was to use a mini computer to build paragraphs, to mix the paragraphs by codes, to capture the name, address, and topics, the codes, and dump those into an IBM 370 so you could index the whole thing. So I took that proposal to the senator and said, I think we can build this machine and dramatically increase the efficiency of corresponding with constituents. He thought it was a good idea, sent the request and the specs that I wrote up to the Senate Rules Committee. And there was a guy, a staffer over there named Tom McGurn, who later became the head of the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, who really got fired up about it. I had suggested they talk to Digital Equipment. So they went out, they talked to DEC, they talked to IBM, they talked to Data General, they talked to everybody that was making mini computers, and they finally ended up picking a machine called a Burroughs L8200, which had a couple of problems, one of which was it was programmed in COBOL, and they got it to work where you could type a letter and it would record it on the tape. The problem is you could only type at about 3 words a minute. It wasn't fast enough. And second, the ball was uppercase only. And when we first started the project with them, they said, oh, we'll make a ball that's upper lowercase. They later came back in the project, and this is going to sound just like a computer salesman. Well, we can't really make the upper lowercase ball. Would it be okay if you sent letters to constituents that were all uppercase? And of course the answer was no. So Burroughs died. Everybody lost faith in the project at that point. We'd spent 1.5 years on it. Everybody was exhausted, and everybody was interested in abandoning it until I saw an ad in Scientific American for a Wang Labs B2200 programmable calculator, they called it. It was actually a mini computer, But by calling it a programmable calculator, they could sell it to government agencies without a computer procurement, which was very long and involved. They could sell this $20,000 machine. This is $20,000 in 1974, which would be what, 80, 100 grand a day, as a programmable calculator. And in the picture, there was an IBM Selectric typewriter connected to this device. So I called Wang in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. They said, we have a Washington sales office. The sales guy came over and I said, look, if you guys can build this thing for us, I'm sure that every Senate committee, House committee, and probably half the House and Senate offices will buy one. You can probably sell at least 300 machines. And so he said, let me make some calls. So he called me back and he said, Ed Lesnick, the vice president of marketing for Wang, wants to come see you. So the next week, Lesnick came down with a programmer, and that's my direct contact with him, not going through the committee. So they came down and they said, okay, this is what we can do. We'll build this for you. We own the software. You pay us a $500 license for it. You buy the machine. We'll program it in assembler so that it will in fact be fast enough. We don't really have an interface to the Selectric. That was just the ad. But what we do have is a more modern version of the Robotype machine that you're using paper tapes, except it's cassette. So I went back to the Rules Committee. They approved another contract. We signed it with Wang, and it basically plays out on key number 5, and that's perseverance. We didn't give up. We kept pushing. And this is what they built for us. I'll tell you another rule, by the way. Take your own pictures as you're inventing these things and not have to go find one on the web, because our machine actually looked a little bit better than this, but this is essentially it. It was really kludgy. There was a CRT screen and a tape drive. There were 80 column wide, 24 lines of text, but the screen was uppercase only. So the text would appear on lines 1, 3, 5, etc. And if it was on the screen with nothing underneath it, the line underneath it, it would print out lowercase. If it had an arrow underneath it, it would print out uppercase. Okay? You generate the document over here on this tape drive. You then move the tape drive, the tape, over to this one on the left, and you can't quite see it. It's cut off in the picture, but that's actually a Cume daisy wheel printer, but there was a Selectric typewriter that did in fact work with, and you could print the letters. We bought it, we installed it. The senator used it in the office from '74 when it was installed till he was defeated by Mac Mattingly in 1980. The real irony of that is that Mac Mattingly was an IBM Selectric salesman in Brunswick, Georgia. But nobody else appreciates that irony. Well, basically what it did is it let us do the work of 5 or 6 typists using this machine. It was incredibly productive. So what played together here is we not only had the idea, we found the right product, we had the right people, Tom McGurn and the folks at Wang, a willingness to take risk on Wang's part, but it was limited because they had most of this stuff already, perseverance to make it happen, and a willingness to change directions as we went through it. From their side, it was an incredible success. It was a huge market. It wasn't the 300 machines in the House and Senate that made it successful. It was every law firm, every accounting firm, anybody that had a big production of documents. In fact, when I graduated from Emory 3 years later and went to work for a large law firm downtown, they had a whole department of Wangs that they were using 2 shifts to produce documents for the lawyers in the firm. It was a high margin item for Wang, it was a low cost of entry for Wang, and it was a blue ocean for them because they had no direct competition versus there was nobody else doing computer-based word processing. They dominated the market for 5 years until the PC came along, and PC-based word processing basically knocked them out of the market. But meanwhile, the typewriter as a primary device for creating documents was being pushed over the cliff. Okay, second part, the right product. This is a little bit tough to talk about in relation to the right idea. How is the right product different from the right idea? This is kind of a bad picture, but does anybody know what that is? MP3 player, exactly right. Diamond Rio MP3 player. Does anybody know what that is? It's one of the first iPods. 2 years later, and basically, Diamond sold 200,000 of their machines. Apple came out with the iPod that was much prettier, much simpler, easier to use, much better software to interface with to get songs loaded into it. Then within a year, they came out with the iTunes Store so you could actually download songs. They cut the deals with the music industry so that it wasn't pirating compared to the Rio, which was all pirated. Apple has sold 300 million iPods since its introduction. That's what I mean by the right product. It's not the idea here, it's the product definition, it's the positioning, and it's the pricing. And I've got to admit, I'm a PC guy, always have been, but nobody does this better than Apple does it. And if you haven't read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, I highly recommend it. Terrific read. It is mostly accurate, very good explanation of how Jobs and Wozniak were inspired by the Altair. All right. I want to keep going with this right product idea. I'm sure everybody has seen these curves. This is Everett Rogers' work on diffusion of innovations. The curve at the bottom is what percentage is adopting it over time. He called them innovators, early adopters, early majority, later majority, and laggards. And if you take the bottom curve and you integrate it, then you get the curve of the penetration. And that S-curve plays out. The point here is that you don't have to create the idea, but what you need to do is catch it just before the inflection point. These are a set of curves of actual technologies that have been introduced and how long it took from their point of introduction until they reached what percentage of the US population that had adopted it, owned an automobile, taken an airplane flight, used a credit card, etc. And one of the interesting things is you see over here the orange line that it's pointing to. By the way, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas did this originally in the late 90s. I updated it about 5-6 years ago, added a few more data points, including the credit card and internet. The internet was invented in 1968. It didn't start to take off until the mid-1990s. That's when the real wealth was created. That's when the real opportunity was many, many years after the original creation of the idea, just before the inflection point. This is a list of some of the early entrants in various categories. VisiCalc got bumped by SuperCalc, got bumped by Lotus 1-2-3, and then Microsoft Excel won. But the point of this is that it wasn't the first entrant in that necessarily won. It was the company that had the right product, the right positioning, and the right pricing. So that brings us, mixed on this one slide, is not only the right product, but it's also a reminder you got to protect what you create. One of the absolutely best definitions I've ever seen of what is necessary for the right product to be adopted comes again from Everett Rogers, and talking about the diffusion of innovations. And in his career, he studied over 400 different innovations, everything from hybrid seed corn to why tribes in Peru would or would not adopt boiling of water to kill the bacteria. And he came up with 5 advantages, or 5 factors, of what makes an innovation likely to succeed. And I'm not going to go through and read the slide to you, but I will encourage you to take a look at his book. It's gone through 6 editions. I won't go through another one by him because he's now passed away. But I want to go back to our technology timeline, but what I want to do is go to 1975, 3 years after the previous slide. Microcomputers are being talked about. Intel is making a 4040 chip and then later an 8080 chip. Integrated circuit memory is starting to be used in the market. CRTs and keyboards are pretty much replacing punch cards. Mainframe and mini computer applications are all over the place. Management Science America here in Atlanta, run by a guy named John Emily, a great Georgia Tech graduate, is the world's largest independent software vendor, and Apple is still 2 years away from being introduced. And the specific problem that was identified and then solved was bookkeeping. Double entry bookkeeping the way we know it today is at least 500 years old, maybe 4,000 years old, with debits and credits always balancing. It was kept in books, hence the name bookkeeping. Ledger books like you see up here. The problem is it's too much labor, too hard to use, too error prone. There's got to be a better way. Well, the better way appeared to us in December 1974 on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, in which they called it the world's first mini computer kit. Pretty quickly people started calling it a microcomputer. And what you see in that, excuse me, what you see here is that it basically created a very inexpensive computer that you could access. What 5 Georgia Tech grads did, all recently out of school, we got together and we built what we call the Total Office Management System, TOM. We previewed it to the American Bar Association in summer of 1976, and I say preview because none of the software actually worked. That's when before we knew that that's the way all software is sold. We later changed the name to Altair Business Software because we cut a deal with Altair to market it. We called it Peachtree Accounting 2 years ago. By 1995, there were 3 million users, about half of whom had actually paid for it. But it was passed by QuickBooks. But Peachtree is still number 2 in the market today. And I say people are the key, partly because John Emily, who bought Peachtree from us, said that. But I think Jim Cooper in his book, Good to Great, says it even better. Get the right people on the bus, get the wrong people off the bus, and then get the right people in the right seats. And my business partner, whom you may know, says you also should use the bus to run over those wrong people, but I won't quite that far. Peachtree Accounting had the right people, willingness to take risk for a time, perseverance for a time, a willingness to change direction, but they couldn't protect what they created entirely because they allowed QuickBooks to come in under them. But they sold too early to MSA. Their patience ran out. They got tired of driving 12-year-old cars and having their spouses bitch about not making any money. The word processing product was never completed and marketed, and they didn't protect the bottom with a simpler product. All right, I'm going to skip through this because I'm running short on time, and I won't go through. This is an interesting story of another group of Georgia Tech folks at Quadram with a great product which basically put the first picture computing on the PC, and then because it wasn't protected, got knocked off by IBM. But I want to come to this for a quick second. This is Clayton Christensen's what happens when you've got the performance that customers can absorb, you've got the performance of current technology keeps getting better and better, but far outstripping what the customer actually needs. Then you get somebody who comes in with new technology. It may be cheaper, it may be simpler, but any point in time, it may not even measure up to what customers actually need, but it is so much easier to use or so much cheaper that it's what Christensen calls disruptive technology. And that's really critical. And that's what happened to Peachtree with QuickBooks, a simpler, easier to use, and slightly less expensive product. All right, I want to do one more thing real quick. I want to go back to this curve, and I want to start with a credit card. The credit card was first invented in the mid-20s. It didn't start to take off until the mid-60s. And does anybody know what enabled the credit card to start to take off in the 60s? I've given you a clue already. I've given you 2 clues, actually. Over the next 45 years, the credit card replaced in-house credit for consumers, almost completely. But why did it languish for 40 years before suddenly taking an uptick in 1966? No guesses. The internet. Yeah. A few years too soon. Good guess, though. It's actually very close. There is a communication issue. First is you finally had reasonably priced mainframes in the market that could process the transactions, not only from IBM, but NCR and Burroughs and Unisys and other companies that are not even there now. And second is that AT&T, in the 19 years since inventing the transistor, had wired the country with electronic switching so you could have a cheap phone call, so that you could verify a card remotely. Until then, you couldn't use a card except in a local dialing area, because there was no way to process a $10 transaction when it cost you $4 to make a long-distance call. The cheap telephone made it happen. And then another 20 years later, consumer credit scoring. Equifax here in Atlanta being one of the leaders. Also a bunch of tech folks over there. And those three technologies allowed the credit card to completely replace in-house credit for retailers. But an interesting thing has happened during that time. And that is, during that same time, what you see over here is that the 15 million businesses that are selling to consumers now have a way of outsourcing their credit, and you actually have a very happy situation of merchant services and the credit card in consumer transactions. Only 2% of retail sales that are done on credit today are still managed in-house by the retailer. But in business to business, exactly the opposite is true. You've got merchant services where you've got small businesses in particular willing to take a card, but their customers, businesses and governments won't use it. Businesses and governments insist on using the old-fashioned accounts payable system, which was 21 trillion last year compared to only 600 billion. I love saying only 600 billion. It's a great market. So only 3% of these transactions was on the credit card. Why do you think these businesses and governments like the old system and won't put purchases on the card? Most of you in here are management majors, right? Business majors. This should be an easy one. Any guesses? They get to keep the money, the float. In fact, if you go look at the balance sheets of a lot of businesses, you will see that they owe their vendors more than they owe the banks. Costco owes its vendors 3 times what it owes the banks. Why? It's free. And they get to decide when to pay it. So what we said was, okay, if we could take, and by the way, the credit card world is very happy that a third of credit card transactions are B2B. What they don't look at is the real denominator, which is they've only got 3% of the total B2B market. And so what we said is, okay, what if we take a system that combines the green dot here of merchants, particularly small ones, which are, by the way, 7 trillion of sales, with the old-fashioned accounts payable system and create a new product. And that's what NOWAccount is. We simply have taken that discontinuity in the market to make this work. What we essentially did was take the fat in the interchange system, which charges the merchant 2.5 to 4.5%. We charge the merchant 2.5 to 3%. The credit card system charges the customer interest and fees. We charge the customer nothing, the buyer nothing, because we've stripped out all this overhead. Do you remember during the dot-com era 12 years ago, disintermediation, the word? Well, this is disintermediation. We've disintermediated all these people in orange, and we're left with a very streamlined system that is extremely profitable to all the participants at the 2.5 to 3%. From the small businesses standpoint, they ask themselves 3 questions. Who are my customers? They're consumers? Fine, use the credit card. Am I selling to businesses or governments? Yes. Do they require terms? Yes. Would you be willing to pay 2.5% to get paid now and not have any risk of the customer never paying? If it's maybe or yes, then they should try NOWAccount. And remember what Roger said about triability and simplicity. We believe it, we live it. So we have a very simple way, looks like an online authorization system for a credit card for somebody to use it. So what we've got, we think, is the 7 points, 7 keys working for us. The right idea, it's a huge market. The 7 trillion of transactions by the small businesses is $150 billion a year recurring revenue opportunity. That's a big market. It's also extremely high margins, which is very happy because it creates great valuations on an exit. There's a high cost of entry, but we figured out how to use opium. That is, other people's money to fund it. And it is clearly a blue ocean. because all of the traditional card processors are over in the very competitive, bloody market of the credit card space, selling to restaurants and nail salons. Right idea, right product we've talked about. It is defined for the customer, and that it's easy to choose, easy to use positioning, and the pricing is simple and less expensive than the alternatives. And I mentioned the fact that we are a big believer in Roger's ways you set this up in terms of relative advantage, compatibility, complexity versus simplicity, triability, and observability. So we're going to check off the right product, the right people. We have an incredible team. Many of you may know my partner, Laura Hodson, who teaches a real estate finance course here. And I believe that someday real estate will be financed again in this country, maybe. But in the meantime, that's a joke, by the way. You can laugh at that. In the meantime, we have got a terrific team put together to make this happen. So I'm going to check off the right people. We have a willingness to take risk. We have perseverance. We are willing to adjust our direction. And at this point, we don't know if we can protect what we've created. We're not deep enough into it. So, questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, how do you handle the risk side of that NOWAccount? Because
Oh,
somebody has to collect the receivables, and someone has to deal with the bad accounts. And how
That's
does
a
that
really good
work?
question. We have, first of all, I'm an ISYE, Laura's an AE. Building a risk management system is nothing compared to flying an airplane. We have a very nicely designed risk management system that has about 6 layers in it, and it's really the risk management piece that makes this so attractive to the other money that's coming in to fund it, because we can give them what is essentially a AAA rated security, yet the underlying asset is trade receivables originated by small businesses. And if I didn't answer the question directly, that's because it's proprietary. We have a patent application filed on that. Atradius, the credit insurer on the account debtors. And yeah, we buy, it's just like a credit card transaction. We buy the receivable, we manage the receivable, we insure the receivable. If it's not collected, it goes to the insurer to collect it, ultimately. Yeah, and there's a lot of layers of credit enhancement in there before that. Other questions? Comments?
I have a question. First, I want to remind everybody that Monday is Impact next week for the introduction to the Ideas to Serve competition. But my question has to do, John, with when you talked to me about this. I was so inspired because you convinced me that this was the biggest employment stimulus. So it's it's a for-profit social business. Can you explain a little bit about that part of this whole thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomena. If you say to a business person, if you had some more capital, would you hire people, buy more inventory, buy machines? And part of that answer depends on what it costs to get that capital. If they have to go sell part of their business, which is really tough to do to raise equity, it's a very high barrier. If they have to fill out an inch-thick set of application forms to go to a bank and get a loan and provide personal guarantees, 3 years of financials, et cetera, it's also a big hurdle. But if you say to them, how about collecting on your invoices in 5 days instead of 50, and all you have to do is go on the web and sign up, that seems pretty comfortable and easy. So essentially what this does is allows us to deliver to small businesses immediate cash that they can then use to grow and stimulate. That's why the Georgia Chamber of Commerce is one of our distribution partners. Credit unions nationally are one of our distribution partners. Delta Community Credit Union here in Atlanta is one of our distribution partners, because they see the advantage of stimulating the economy. In fact, we're working on a campaign that we call Grow America Now, and then in each state, like Grow Georgia Now, to promote this as small business stimulus. And if it does good by helping us stimulate the economy, we're thrilled. If it makes a huge amount of shareholder value, we're even more thrilled. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Mike Elders. I'm studying finance here at Georgia Tech. I was wondering, what is the biggest challenge you're facing in the implementation and growing the business? Because it sounds really great on paper.
First of all, it's a relatively complex model. The risk model that we were talking about a minute ago is a relatively complex model. And what we basically had to do is go out, first of all, line up distribution partners. Second, get the risk model developed and proven. Third, raise the money, the tens of millions of dollars necessary to put this to work. And then get all the back office functions working properly. So none of it was by itself impossible to do, but putting all of that together was very complex. We're actually, after a year and a half of working on it, we're supposed to close, I better not even say it, well I will. We're supposed to close Delta first loan tomorrow, and then we've got a whole bunch of other loans lined up behind that. So hopefully all of this is about to come into place after a year and a half of development. It's like when John Kennedy announced making the trip to the moon, he said by the end of this decade we're going to put men on the moon. That wasn't the tough part, because then what he said is, and return them safely to Earth. So that's kind of our issue. The front part of this is easy. It's doing the full execution that's the toughest part. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes, sir. Just speak up. I can hear you.
I'm Sam Citro, I'm a management major, and one of the companies I was co-oping at recently, they actually went into Chapter 11 a few months ago, specifically because customers just couldn't pay on time.
Right.
He said 50 days and 90 days was good for us.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, that was really hurting our vendor relations, and this seriously remediated that situation. And
That's exactly right.
I know with the banking industry, things are very slow to change because you mess up once and you get no trust at all. What are you doing to help build trust with vendors and customers with a new product?
Well, first of all, small businesses are very quick to adopt this. They look at it and they say, oh my gosh, this is so easy. In part because we're not saying you've got to put everything through here. You pick which customers you want to get paid early on. You use it as it fits your business. Their buyers, their customers don't even know it exists. I mean, it's invisible to the account debtor, to the buyer. One of the things we decided early on is not to try to take this out through commercial banks, because they are, first of all, they're slow to adopt technology anyway. Secondly, they're still under stress. They're still paralyzed from the housing fiasco. And so we decided to go completely different routes. That's why we're marketing it through credit unions and marketing it through organizations like the Chamber of Commerce.
Let's go here and then go back.
Yes, sir.
Alex Cooper, Biomedical Engineering. One of your keys to innovation is the right people. So I was wondering, when looking for the right people, what are some of the characteristics you really look for in them? And on top of that, when trying to identify people that specialize in things that you don't know much about yourself, how can you tell the difference between people that really do know and their stuff and can bring it to the table versus those that are very good at talking?
You know, that's really one of the toughest. And I'm afraid I've got to admit to you that a lot of the having the right people is trial and error. And that, you know, being willing to step up and say, this was a mistake, I shouldn't have made that hire. And I'm not going to tell you that I am a terrific judge up front of whether or not that person's really going to be able to work. Unless I listen to my wife, because I'm not kidding. She really has a sense of people, and every time she has told me they're not going to work out, she's been exactly right. So I really need to listen to her more than I do. But I don't know. I can't do it. I'm not a very good judge, but I am really good at being able to sense within a relatively short period of time whether that person ought to be on the bus or not, and if they ought to stay on the bus, what seat they ought to be in. But telling whether to let them on the bus in the first place, I'm not very good at it. So I can't answer that. I don't know.
Parker Vasic, aerospace engineering. How did you position yourself in your career to be involved in so many startups? How did you find them? What did you do?
Unmedicated ADD. I'm not kidding. Had I been born 20 or 30 years later, I would have been on Ritalin and probably would have done none of this. But I don't have hyperactivity, or I would never have made it through law school. But when you stop and you think about how these different things can connect, and they're kind of outside the box, it just, it just makes sense. Questions, comments? Yes?
You talked about how it's exciting to be an innovator, and I was just wondering, what's the most exciting thing during this process of creating now and just getting it kicked off and everything to you, other than like the big market and the product?
The fun of having really good weeks where lots of good things happen every week. I mean, that's the most fun part. And then coupled with that is seeing other people out there across the country, people that run credit unions, people that run the state leagues of credit unions, regulators even get excited about this. I mean, we were in California a few months ago and met with the guy who is the chief regulator of credit unions in California to tell him this was coming so they wouldn't be surprised when he went in to do the examination to see this in the credit union. And he was pretty neutral during the whole thing. And we got to the end, and Lucy Ito with the California Credit Union League said to him, well, what do you think? He said, this is amazing. This is the best thing I've seen for credit unions. That really is exciting to see people appreciate it. Then the other thing is, when we walk folks like that through the risk model and we show them how we manage the risk, and they come to understand it, they really appreciate the elegance of it. It's like a beautiful machine that's been built, or a beautiful piece of code that's been written. It really is a very nice design. And when other people appreciate that design, that makes us feel good. But we'll feel even better when we close Delta tomorrow. So, Keith?
So you've
Oh,
been
Kevin,
through-
I'm sorry.
That's right.
Kevin, sorry.
So you've been through a couple of these kind of companies. In each of those, is there an aha moment of success, or do you have certain metrics that you use to track success?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, break even, okay? Happiness is positive cash flow. I mean, that's always, because what that basically means is you're no longer dependent on somebody else's equity to make it work. You can grow it yourself. I mean, that's probably the most important single metric. But most of these other metrics, I mean, we've all done the models, we've all done the charts, we've all done the hockey stick growth. It never works out that way. But the one metric that I would say, and by the way, let me tell you one thing. I think this is really important. And that is, when you look at this, if you don't define, besides positive cash flow, if you don't define your metrics in some way related to your customers and their satisfaction, you're making a mistake. Because ultimately, that's what keeps you from being knocked out by another competitor, is extremely good customer relations. They will stick with you. They will be loyal to you. If you have treated them right, if you treated them honestly, if you admit your mistakes, even if somebody comes into the market with a cheaper product, a product's got more features, et cetera, they'll give you time to catch up. So I would say those are the two. Good question. Other questions, comments?
So what's the opposite of that question? How did you know when it was time to get off the bus for each of your different opportunities?
Well, part of it came in the frustration over Peachtree, because when I graduated from Emory, graduated from law school, I didn't go back I did Peachtree all the way through law school. And then when I graduated, or 6 months before graduation, and I was talking about rejoining the software company, my wife, who was pregnant with our first child, said, there is no effing way you're not going to take a job with a law firm. I just put you through law school. You're not going back to that software company. So I went down to Alston, Miller & Gaines and was practicing corporate and securities law while the rest of the guys at Peachtree were starving. So when John Emily came in and offered them, they were making about $8,000 a year. He offered them $50,000 a year. This is a long time ago. New BMWs, moving out of the shabby offices they were in into the tower over near Lenox. They jumped at it. and myself and the other outside investors were saying, wait a minute, we're 6 weeks away from IBM announcing the product, announcing the IBM PC with Peachtree as one of the pieces of software they're introducing. This company will be worth 10 times what it's worth today in a year, but we couldn't prevail. So ever since that time, I have always been reluctant to look at exiting too early. Sometimes you can't help it. I mean, sometimes you get to a point where it's just, you just know it's the right time. But I don't know what the metric is exactly. You just have to make that decision as you go. But the one thing you do want to do, you want to make that exit before QuickBooks comes in and knocks you off first place. I'll tell you that. Yes. I'm sorry, I thought I saw another hand here.
While they're thinking of the questions, a couple of students were gathered early, and I encouraged them to ask questions, and they said, well, what should we ask? And I said, well, ask him how long his hair was in 1969. Do you remember?
About the same as it is now.
Yeah. He's one of the straight arrows. He looked exactly the same. He was one of the biggest of the BMOCs on campus, and he looked just like that. That's a classic 1969 fraternity haircut.
Well, Bill, how long was your hair in 1969? Yeah. No, it was, I mean, that's the interesting thing about tech and tech students. I mean, there has been some change over the last 40 years or so, but, you know, not that much. I mean, I look around the campus now. I was across the street at the ATDC for 7 years with FTrans, you know, and one of the reasons we came was to be close to the campus and close to the students. And it's the same smart, hardworking core that we've always seen. And there'll be a lot of great innovators in this group. There'll be a lot of great companies started. And if I've given you any kind of seeds to help you think about that, then I've accomplished my mission today. Good. Anything else? Terry?
I'm wondering if there are particular industries that this would help. And what I have in mind is one of the sectors of the economy is healthcare, which is being debated in the Supreme Court. It's very much on a lot of our minds this week.
Yeah.
How could the NOWAccount reduce healthcare costs?
You know, healthcare is one area that this is really tough to do, mainly because even if the doctor or the provider is billing Medicare or an insurance company and it's technically a B2B transaction, the underlying transaction is a consumer transaction, and there is so much in the way of disputes and reductions, et cetera. That's one area that we really can't work in. And I don't, now, if it's a manufacturer of equipment or a provider of supplies selling to a physician, where it's just a very straight transaction, we can do that. But I don't really think we're going to be able to do much in the healthcare arena. But almost any other, whether it's manufacturing, wholesale distribution, professional services, legal. The funny thing about this is the one profession, we've got engineers, we've got architects, we've got lawyers, accountants won't use it. They seem to think they can manage it better, more efficiently internally than outsourcing it. But just about every other professional group we've been able to provide service to. Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.